my name is Madison. Welcome to my channel. And in today's video, I will be talking about the podcast that I enjoy listening to. I'm going to separate this into two separate groups. The first group is going to be more independent podcasters, podcasts that have grown up from the ground, from nothing. The hosts were not famous or well known before the podcast started. And then the second group is going to be more produced podcasts that have hosts that have already had a following before they started podcasting, as well as the more narrative podcasts that are scripted like a TV show, but it's a podcast. So the very first podcast I ever listened to was The History Chicks. The hosts are Susan and Beckett, and they go through a woman's life from birth to death. So nobody who's still living can be on their podcast, but they do an awesome job at going through a woman's life and giving her the justice that she deserves. They have about 150-ish, probably more at this point, episodes that you can listen to. They have a huge backlog. They have episodes on more well-known ladies, and then maybe some ladies that you've never heard about. But it's always fun to listen to them and have their conversation about these women. Their podcast started about 10 years ago, and they have grown their podcast from the ground up, and they are now part of the Wondery podcast network, which is well known. They have a lot of great podcasts that are produced by them that they have absorbed into their network, and I enjoy most podcasts that come from the Wondery network. The second podcast in my first category is Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, that's hosted by Liv. I love this podcast. A lot of it is because it is a podcast hosted by a single host and not a two-host podcast. So she's given me a lot of inspiration on how I want to do my podcast and how I would have it and how I would structure my podcast as a single person hosting a podcast instead of having a conversational podcast with two separate people. Her podcast is about Greek mythology, sometimes a little bit of Roman mythology, but mostly Greek, and she tends to view it from a more feminist angle, and I really enjoy that because that's not something you see a lot with Greek mythology, but I enjoy her greatly. And also, side note, it is not safe for work. She does curse a lot in that, so keep that in mind if you want to listen to it. The third podcast in my first category would be Vulgar History with host Ann Foster, another huge inspiration for me as another single person hosting a podcast. Her podcast also focuses solely on women. A lot of the episodes that she's done thus far have revolved around European women's history, and that is just her background. She does have podcast episodes about women from other parts of the world, but a lot of it is essentially located in Europe, primarily during like the Tudor time period. Oh, also she has this fun little segment at the end where she rates all of the women on a skin deliciousness scale, which is really awesome, and it just adds like another aspect to her podcast that I really love. The fourth podcast is called Two Girls on a Bench. It's not a history related podcast. It's actually a writing podcast hosted by Trisha and Shauna, and they have been best friends for like 20 years of their life, and they have a lot of stories to tell while also focusing on doing a writing prompt and reading what they've written during the episode. They also do this fun segment like once every 1 to 2 months called Bench Write Club, and they have their listeners send in stories from a prompt that they have told us, and I have actually sent in one of my writing pieces and have had it read on their podcast, and that was pretty exciting to have that listener interaction part of their podcast. So I would definitely recommend them. Also not safe for work. They do curse. Side note, the Vulgar History podcast also curses, so not safe for work. The fifth podcast is one that I just recently got caught up with all 350-ish episodes that they have in their backlog, would be Generation Y, hosted by Aaron and Justin. I like the way that they treat every story. It's really respectful, and they do a great job going over the details. They also do a good job focusing on some maybe lesser known stories that you don't really hear about on a lot of true crime podcasts, so I would definitely recommend them. And this podcast is hosted by the Wondery podcast network, so I have quite a few of the Wondery podcast networks on here, especially in the next category. The sixth podcast that I have on this list would be This Podcast Will Kill You. That podcast is hosted by two epidemiologists, Aaron and Aaron, both named Aaron. They go over different diseases. They talk about the biology of the disease, the history of disease, and where we currently stand modern day with the disease. And I really like it. The history aspect is really interesting. They go through a lot of how they discovered that this disease was separate from other diseases, because way back when, like 150 years ago, not really that long ago. A lot of diseases were like lumped under the same thing, even though they were different diseases, but they go through the discovery of the disease, the way that it was treated during that time, how we've learned more about it as the years have progressed, and how we currently treat it. So I enjoy that one. I would definitely recommend it. And that one's hosted on the Exactly Right Network. And the last one for this category is probably a more well-known podcast. It's been around for a really long time. It's Lore. That's hosted by Aaron Mahnke. He goes through a lot of lore and folklore throughout the world, and his stories have more of like a creepy or kind of spooky undertone to them sometimes. There's one episode in particular, the one with Robert the Doll. That one totally creeps me out, so I would recommend him. Maybe don't listen to it at night if you don't like scary things. But he definitely does a great job, and he's a really good storyteller. And the composer that he has for his episodes, Chad Lawson, he is awesome. I love listening to his stuff. I listened to him a lot when I would study for college, and now when I do my podcast research, I'll listen to him sometimes, but it's really great music. All right, now moving on to the second category of podcasts that are run by larger podcast networks and hosted by people who already kind of had a following before they started podcasting, so kind of a bigger fan base than the ones that I had previously listed, even though some of those ones have now grown to be really big. They started off really small. So the first one on this list is My Favorite Murder. I started listening to them a while ago. I keep up with their episodes. It's a great time. Karen and Georgia, they both pick a murder for their episodes and then they talk about it. And there's also a lot of side conversations. They've had a lot of experiences that maybe the regular person just hasn't experienced. So it's fun for me to listen to them talk, and they just have a great dynamic between the two of them, and it's always a good listen. So the next two are kind of related. They're both from the Wondery Network. The first one is American Scandal, and the second one is American History Tellers. They're both hosted by Lindsey Graham, but they are both scripted podcasts, so they have more of a narrative to them, similar to how Lore does. But with these ones, it's kind of like reading a book that's written in the third person. It has that kind of feel to it. I really enjoy these ones. They are really descriptive and you feel really immersed in the story. I would definitely recommend these ones. They are always a fun listen. Number 4 is one that I just started recently listening to. It's called Stuff Mom Never Told You. They have a huge backlog of episodes, and I am still in the 2009 episodes. So I have a long way to go before I actually finish this podcast. But so far, it started off really well. It started in 2009, so the audio is not the best, but I've listened to a couple of their more recent episodes, so it does get better with time. They've posted like twice a week since they started the podcast back in 2009, so there's a lot of content, and it's just a lot of fun little tidbits, stuff Mom never told you. So it's a good listen, and I would recommend it to someone who is looking for some things pertaining to women's history. The next two are scripted storytelling podcasts, so it is a complete narrative podcast. It is not really based on truth or fact. It is a story. They are both really great and produced really well, in my opinion. Some people have some other opinions about them, but I personally enjoyed them. The first one is The Bright Sessions. This one starts off with a therapist who is a therapist for individuals who have certain abilities, and it goes through the course of them discovering their abilities and or how they deal with their abilities or how their abilities have affected them. And then it goes from there, and there's like some drama, but it's really great, and I don't want to spoil any of it for you, so I would listen to that one. The second one is Limetown. This one has been around for a while, so you might have already heard about it, but it follows a journalist through her research and discovery of the questionable history and past of a town called Limetown, and I would recommend this one to anyone who wants to listen to a nice narrative podcast. It's a good listen and it keeps you engaged. So that concludes the list of some of my favorite podcasts. I've listened to other ones, but these ones are the ones that I would consider my favorites or that I would recommend to people as I'm doing to you now. I do try to search out for podcasts that are smaller and hosted by non-corporate entities. I just want to support a podcast that is homegrown, recorded in someone's bedroom, and help them to grow. Not that there's anything wrong with listening to podcasts that are produced by larger corporations or larger well-known celebrity figures, but they do also have that upper hand in the listeners, and I know as someone who's going to be starting a podcast that trying to get the listener is the hardest part, especially when a lot of the podcasts that are in the recommended and new and noteworthy in like iTunes and Spotify are bigger podcasts that will have a million listens on the first day just because of who the host is. So I do try to search out for those podcasts that are smaller, maybe don't have as much of a following. I scroll like all the way to the bottom to try and find them. And I do look periodically to find these podcasts, and I'll subscribe to them and add them to my listen list. I have a bunch of podcasts in my subscriptions that I haven't listened to yet. I like to listen to podcasts from the very beginning until I get caught up, and then I'll start another podcast from the very beginning until I get caught up, but I'll also keep up with the other podcasts that I've already listened to and listen to those ones as they get published, while continuing to listen to the new one from start to finish. So I do like a combination of binge listen and the weekly updates I'll listen to. So that's usually how I listen. And I consume the content so quickly. I usually listen to podcasts on 1.5 speed. If the podcast host has like kind of like an already faster talking tone, I will lower it to 1.2, but I usually listen to things a little faster than they are because I want to listen to as much content as possible. And that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, and maybe you'll go out and listen to some of these podcasts that I just recommended. And if you have any podcasts that you listen to and enjoy that aren't listed here, go ahead and comment them down below. And with that, I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!